Confession. William had met Imina in graduate school. English was less familiar to her, and this interested him. They would spend time taking walks along the river where Imina spoke in Swahili, and William would listen to see what he understood, even though he had never studied the language. It was a game they'd play for hours. He was struck by the short, sharp sounds as Imina spoke. And as time passed, her words became less opaque to him. This was most apparent when she recited ancestral poems. He was not able to take them for himself, to use them, but he could sense Imina's understanding by listening carefully to the nuances from her throat and the muscles in her face. Her eyes often shut when the most difficult meanings were spoken, when she felt the truth of what she was saying. So William did not rely on the look in her eyes in order to hear. They were both reading the same texts as everyone they knew. And when they met in groups, it was an unspoken requirement to parrot those texts, the words that were new to them, those outside the vernacular language of their community. Imina found this stranger than William, as language to her was something used to connect and maintain your family's history, not separate you from it. But here it seemed it was being used to convince, to build a shared understanding, to view the world in a particular way, a useful way, and as Imina noticed, a way that led to forgetting. As Imina discussed this with William, they became close friends. He understood immediately what she described, as he had frequently observed the application of prescribed language. Similar issues had surfaced when he studied artificial intelligence as a boy, and he had also seen the merging of artificial intelligence, filtering, and political control through search engine applications, both when his father had been targeted and now by the banks. So listening to Imina as she spoke her natural language had become important to him, not only because it brought him closer to Imina, but because it helped him to remember that his father's and now his work was not in vain. The world was not hopeless. Not everyone was susceptible to the vainglorious rewards of mastery as his friends had been, one by one by one. Turning away from this desire opened William up to learning more. And it kept him away from becoming fated to a life of mimicking words and concepts that were only the reflection of the distributed form of control designed by the unseen. Where before fascism could be easily identified as it had a uniform and a leader, in William's world it was much more diffuse. It always came in the form of something else, something appropriated, borrowed, stolen. It embodied the words and images of freedom, of those writers and theorists who had been intent on removing themselves from unmitigated control. But it was precisely because they hoped to achieve this end, and their words had a chance to effect change, that the unseen took their words for their own. The same thing had happened with the texts of the early Christians, who were also considered dissidents thousands of years ago. It was what motivated the First Council of Nicaea to selectively choose, publish, and name their text, the Bible, omitting that which they felt might cause an overturn of those in power. Imina and William knew instinctively that everyone who used designated language were merely helping to facilitate the collapse of unprescribed language in constructing the future of silence, where nothing was spoken that reached out from within, where everything was surface, in conformity, in happy confinement. Amina helped William with his work. It was not intentional, but only occurred because of the intersection of her path with his. It had no political agenda. In fact, it was in spite of the overarching political agenda that surrounded both of them. William woke the next morning, turned over, and looked at his phone as it flashed and vibrated on the glass covering the table. It was a call from Amina. Although it had been several months since they last spoke, there was no distance between them. He told her about Anna's words last night. Amina fell silent, but then she offered, "Why don't you come here for a while? Bring Anna." William thought for a few moments. It felt right. But he wasn't sure if he would be able to leave the States right now. They were closing down the ability for Americans to leave the country based on what was loosely considered dissent, which included almost anything. But in William's case, there was a history. A dossier on his family had been created by law enforcement at the request of the unseen long ago. Although there was no public information on William's work, the informal incidents he was experiencing told him the data collection on his daily life was increasing. And then there were the psychological tactics of the anti-tribe to remind him he was being watched, like the images and voicemail he had received last night, the online counts taken out impersonating him and referencing details in his banking history. But all this was not necessarily as ominous as it sounded. Because of his father's work, there was an ongoing interest in anyone associated with him. Anna was right. To be shadowed was something she may inherit, just as William had inherited it. Considering the move made the air around William feel clearer, and he found he felt lighter throughout the day. He hadn't felt this good in a long time. It made him realize just how much he had been impacted by the intimidation he had experienced over the years. But he knew he was not the only one, and somehow remembering the stories of others, whose lives were no longer their own, whose privacy was destroyed, made it feel less threatening. Remembering reminded him that the efforts against him were much less severe than those who had exposed wrongdoing in government agencies. Their lives were often completely destroyed. They were never allowed to work again, as false stories about their work history were placed in HR databases. They lost their homes, their families, their friends. If you put their name in a search engine, you came up with bizarre incidents and false court documents, reflecting a full-scale disinformation campaign on their history, including their medical history. Their accomplishments always became somehow lost to search engine results. Some woke up to rifles pointed at their heads as military SWAT teams stood over them, while others were placed in prisons for years without ever being charged with a crime under the auspices of the Patriot Act. It was hard to believe this was happening in the United States, a country with one of the most beloved constitutions ever written. A protecting document that had been slowly dismantled by the handful of men and women who shielded the backstory from the public with the help of the corporate media. No, his own concerns did not compare, but still they impacted him, both psychologically and physically. Maybe more so because of what had happened to his father, and he worried about the impact it was having on Anna. In a sense, the unseen and their anti-tribe were changing the genetic pattern of his family, by impacting the health of generations. William knew treating U.S. citizens as if they were enemies of war within their own country had not come about quickly. Strangely, it had developed over the same number of decades it had taken the bank's grid to creep over the commodity and equity markets and farming. It was merely an overabundance of greed, nothing more. It wasn't some grand conspiracy. William had figured this out when he looked into his father's death. There was nothing inherently new about the interest which led to his death. It was fear and dread of sharing wealth, fear of dilution. But then, this had often been the cause of wars throughout history. And the other tactics used to intimidate William and others of concern, the actions of the anti-tribe, were just another expression of sadism, just a reflection of the type of person who wanted to participate in this shutting down, this narrowing of society.